Welcome, everyone. We'll get started. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I'm the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the University of Minnesota's China Center's Considering China webinar, China Social Media in Times of Crises, with Professor Guobing Yang. Thank you for your support of the China Center and the Considering China webinar series. I wish to offer a special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. Please consider helping us to provide engaging programming like this with a gift to the China Center. You may do so through the link on the bottom of the webinar announcement or on our website. Today's speaker, Professor Guobing Yang, is the Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the Annenberg School of Communication and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's also the director of the Center for Digital Culture and Society and deputy director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. He is the author of several books, including The Power of the Internet in China, Citizen Activism Online, The Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China, and the Wuhan Lockdown. Today, he will discuss how ordinary social media users take to social media platforms to share stories of their daily lives in the context of increasing complex social and political environments in China and the world, and why such digital storytelling is important in the times of crises. Please submit your questions that you may have throughout the program through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the program. So thank you and welcome, Professor Yang. Please get started. How's that?
Thank you so much. Thank you for your very kind introduction, John. And I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk to the audience of the China Center about Chinese social media. So let me start sharing my screen so we can see our slides here. All right. Is it working okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Yes,
okay, great. All right. So let me just, I think I will start by showing some slides, giving a sense of the China social media landscape, much of which may be already familiar to this audience, but I hope that will be still helpful for my discussions about social media use during the pandemic, especially during the Wuhan lockdown period. So the Chinese social media landscape, when we talk about Chinese social media, when we often get questions like, what is China's internet like, right? What is China's social media like? It's not easy question to answer. As a matter of fact, it's not, because it's not one thing. It's a lot of things. So I call this a kind of China's variegated social media landscape. So I'll just show some numbers, give some sense, some social media platforms, and then we talk about how social media were used during the pandemic. This is relatively recent numbers, I suppose. My graph figure here runs up to 2022. The most recent report, I think, of the China's social media users, internet users, is over 1 billion, 1.92 billion, and that is about 78% of China's entire population. So we can see very steady and rapid growth of the number of internet users. So it's now over 1 billion of the population are Chinese internet users. In comparison with internet user numbers around the world, because of the absolute number of the size of the population, China now is, in terms of the absolute number of internet users, China tops the world. So here I show this is top 10 countries by the number of internet users. So China tops the world. This is based on numbers from 2022. And then we have India, United States, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, Russia, Bangladesh, and Japan. in terms of the percentage of the population here, we see that United States still ranks at the top of the world. But the size of the population matters a lot when we come to understand how people interact online and what kind of interactions happen and what kind of cultural processes are associated with this kind of interactions. I think the size of the population matters a lot, and I hope we'll keep that in mind in our discussions about social media use and in the examples that I'm going to give later on. So I will say a few words in just to try to characterize what kind of culture is it like. I would say, like many other countries, China's internet culture is full of fun, humor, memes, and of course nowadays also a lot of disinformation, misinformation. But this year, China is and just entered its 30-year anniversary of the internet in China. Overall, I think over this 30-year period, a very strong participatory internet culture has appeared, and it involves all kinds of online communities, very diverse communities as well, and different kinds of people, age groups, different kind of social categories, rural, urban, populating different communities, and therefore it's also very hard to say that there's one Chinese internet culture. That there are many Chinese internet cultures, depending on what kind of platforms you use, what kind of live streaming platforms you use, what kind of online communities people usually visit on a regular basis. And another important thing is that since so much of the population now is online, we could say that the internet and social media are now deeply integrated into everyday life. And here we see this, more clearly than ever during the pandemic, when people could not leave their homes or their communities. Everything had to work based on their social media kind of accounts, and so it's deeply integrated into everyday life. So this is one of the things I wanted to emphasize, that there are many social media platforms in China. There are many internets, you might even say, and they're not the same. There's not, just like China, there's, of course, China is China, but there's not one China. China is hard to characterize what China is like, because there are so many regional, local differences. Same thing, I would say, when we come to talk about internet culture. So there are some things that people, all do when, if you're using the internet, you'll be using the internet for some similar things, definitely, delivery, food delivery, communicating with friends and families, and so on and so forth. But there are also things that, some people do some things that others don't do, and people go to different sites for different kinds of things. So I'll show you some platform. These are some of the logos of the major social media platforms. Among the more popular ones, Weibo, and WeChat, and Baidu is the search engine, most popular search engine in China. I think these are certainly platforms that a lot of people would use quite regularly for different purposes. Of course, even when I do internet search for Chinese language material, I use Baidu a lot, and for English language, of course, I use Google a lot. So we have a few examples here, and then we have a really vast landscape of all kinds of apps and social media platforms, and they tend to attract different kind of social groups. Like Kuaishou is a short video platform, like Douyin, which is the Chinese TikTok on the left-hand side. they tend to have very short videos, 30 seconds, a couple of minutes, full of entertainment content. And so they attract particular kinds of populations, people with different kinds of interests. And then on the right-hand side, Bilibili, 小红书, I think English is red, and in the middle, 豆瓣, sort of have some somewhat different kind of demographics. Bilibili has long videos, has, even lectures, public lectures by academics, celebrities, and their films, documentary films, all kinds of longer video materials you will find there. And popular Chinese intellectuals can become celebrities on Bilibili through their public lectures. And on a Zoom event like this, which are often held on Bilibili, it's easy just to get tens of thousands of listeners for one session. That's so, and then red 小红书. We have in our school here, in our center, actually, we have a postdoctoral fellow who studies 小红书, and I learn about it from her work. And I learned that 小红书has a lot of young women users. 豆瓣 is started as a kind of film review website, but now it covers a lot of things, including reading groups, and some of these are closed groups, but very full of rich and detailed discussions about all kinds of issues, films, books, social issues, and so on and so forth. So very, very variegated social media landscape. So that's just a few slides to give a sense of the many things, many platforms and apps out there, but that's only just a few examples, and I don't think we have time and there's probably no need to go over a lot of these, since a lot of us probably are familiar with that landscape, just give a sense of that. And now I turn to the use of social media in crisis situations. In this case, I'm using the Wuhan lockdown in spring 2020 as an example, mainly because I did a lot of research during that period and wrote my book, The Wuhan Lockdown, based on the material I collected online during that time. So much of this material I will just share actually come from the book, but I sort of try to organize it in a somewhat different way for the ease of presentation and our discussion. So I'll just also highlight only some elements from the book. This is not a book talk, and I really just want to use this occasion to talk about how social media may be used during times of crisis, using the Wuhan lockdown as an example. So I have a list of things, list of PowerPoints here to go down, just to show how social media were used during that time. So this is one example. At the very beginning of the Wuhan lockdown, when the city, again, we all remember Wuhan was the first city to be locked down, and it was done very abruptly. And after the city went on its lockdown mode, there was a lot of crisis situations. People need a lot of relief support in Wuhan. So there were online fundraising campaigns from around the country, even outside of China, to try to raise funds and donate all kinds of medical, other material goods to residents in Wuhan. And some of these fundraising campaigns were very powerful and effective, to the extent that they were efficient in the early days. Again, they were even more efficient than China's Red Cross Society in terms of raising funds rapidly and shipping whatever they were able to raise from around the country. So this is one example of the kind of work, very detailed work that the volunteers were doing during their fundraising campaigns. So on the right-hand side, you will see you couldn't really read anything. This is Excel sheet. This is page 10 to page 18 of a long Excel sheet, which were posted on Weibo by one of the major online fundraising campaigns. And this Excel sheet documents the amount of funds that each user donated. The campaign was organized, and this is something notable, and I'll talk more about this later on if we have time. It's organized by an online fandom club. Online fandom club. There are a lot of fandom clubs around the world, in China as well. People gather online, organize to basically for the sake of their own common idols. So it's an entertainment kind of organization, but they are very, very well organized. So when the lockdown started, they activated their organizational structure for fundraising. So all these donations in the Excel sheet, individual members' names and the amount of donations that they donate. A lot of this is just several dollars, not much money, but it's a huge number of people participating in this. And because these were posted on Weibo, Weibo users, similar to Twitter, you can comment, you can like, you can interact. So on this page here, we can see a few lines of text. Here is people are interacting. Somebody said here, I saw my name there, and I'm so happy. And others would praise everyone. Wow, you're doing such a great job. So this is a very interesting, I think, kind of activity. People are not only doing fundraising, but showing that they're very responsible. They want to be accountable. So they want to document all their activities in very detailed ways, the amount of money, things that were done, and donations listed, and so on and so forth. So this is one example, online fundraising campaigns by online fandom groups. Animal rescue volunteer. And I wrote about one case in the book. And this again was at the very beginning of the lockdown, when people who were traveling outside of the city couldn't get back home, and they had pets, cats and dogs at home, and they couldn't feed their pets. So when some individuals found out this situation, they quickly started organizing volunteers to help feed the pets, left behind animals. And the organizing was done, again, using social media. WeChat was particularly useful. And I followed one group, which just, in a matter of days, hundreds of people joined the group, and they started going around the city to try to feed the animals left behind. So on the right-hand side, the volunteers packaging and distributing donated pet food, and there are pet food also being sent to Wuhan from around the country. So volunteers organizing for animal rescue was a very, very interesting kind of civic engagement activity in the early days of the Wuhan lockdown. So these both individuals and one organization, which is called Wuhan Small Animal Protection Association, was particularly active. I follow this organization on WeChat. I still follow it because I've always also been interested in environmental animal protection issues, and they're very small organization, very small group of volunteers, but they were actually doing a lot of things, and they did it in very creative ways. For example, to feed the animals, the pets left behind? How when the owners were not home, how would they arrange for the volunteers to go and do that kind of work? They would work together with the owners, and then they will find locksmiths who would go there at the same time to help unlock the door, and everything will be streamed or recorded so that the owner could see of exactly what was happening. This is a kind of accountability, but also safety and security issues. So this is another kind of example of civic engagement during the Wuhan lockdown. Next is anti-domestic violence campaign and civic campaigns on other feminist issues. There are quite a few of these. One of these is specifically called anti-domestic violence little vaccine campaign. And so on the left-hand side, you see the Weibo account of this campaign. I'm actually using these two screenshots from an article written by Professor Hongwei Bao, who teaches in UK. He wrote very quickly early to 2020, I think, a very nice article about this campaign. I also wrote about this in my book, but not in as detailed manner as Dr. Bao did. So I used two screenshots from his article. So again, we might recall that after the lockdown, because everybody was staying home, kind of domestic violence began to rise in China. I think we also read news of similar kind of rise in other places, and therefore that's the reason for this campaign. Feminist activists in China immediately began to organize to try to bring awareness to people, and this is one of their projects at the time. They did it in, again, always in creative ways. They tried to spread the word online, but they also printed out. They wrote a kind of open letter to residents around the country, families around the country, and they asked volunteers, if possible, print out this open letter. And in this case, on the right-hand side, you see this photograph, this young volunteer. She hand copied the open letter and then posted letter in the neighborhood. In this case, I think is in the elevator, to raise awareness. But also at the end of their open letter, they included China's law against anti-domestic violence. So it's also kind of raising legal awareness about these issues. That's another, and this involves interesting online and offline kind of interactions. And typically, volunteers, as part of their campaign, volunteers would, after they posted their open letters offline, they would take a photo like this one, and there are others. They would take a photo and then they will post it back to the social media, WeChat or Weibo. And so there is a kind of circulation of information. And that's another way of disseminating and raising awareness. Speaking of volunteering, there are all kinds of volunteers. We see students who were, because remember, the lockdown was in January, late January, and that was during the Chinese Lunar New Year period. So there are a lot of students traveling back home to Wuhan from outside of China, or from outside of Wuhan, even from outside of China back home to visit their families. And some of these became volunteers. And in this case, this is a passage from my book. It's a volunteer who was a student, a graduate student, I believe in UK, and she was visiting her mom back in Wuhan, and then she joined one of these volunteer campaigns, delivering donated goods around the city. And what her mother did was her mother didn't quite want her daughter to do it alone. So she would go on all these delivery trips together with her daughter. So this is the passage, I'll just read it. So in her mother's words, because of the lockdown, she had to stay at home for a long time, right? This is a joyful thing to me. This actually should be, this is a direct quote. Maybe she will never have another chance of staying at home for such a long time. We can do things together. We have so much time to spend together and talk. That's why if she needs to go out to do volunteer work, I'm happy to accompany her. Mothers are all like this. If I follow her and watch over her, I can always remind her. This way I feel less anxiety too. It's better than letting her run around outside on her own. So this is a mother talking about going around the city with her daughter who was working as a volunteer. Social media were also used in all sorts of ways for for mourning the dead, for memorializing, and for documenting the history of the period. I'm showing here a screenshot of a very famous page. Probably many of us already seen this page. This is Dr. Li Wenliang's page on Weibo. So Dr. Li was known as the whistleblower of the coronavirus, and he was a doctor at the Wuhan Central Hospital, and later on he died of COVID. He was active on Weibo even before COVID, and he continued to post after COVID started. So on the top of this page, it was a post, his post on January the 31st, 2020, basically saying, today I finally got to know that my COVID test was positive. After Dr. Li died, people continued to come to his website to leave comments and remarks. So if you can see, probably not very clearly, this number of likes, 4 million, over 4 million likes, over 1 million comments. I'm sure it's many more million comments, because I think after the number of comments exceeds 1 million, the platform no longer shows the exact number. In my book, when I was writing about this in 2020, was almost I think in early 2020, it was almost already close to 1 million, and people still continue to post. And so this page I did the screenshot that shows April 27th. This year, just a few days ago, when in preparation for this talk, I thought I would do a screenshot and show it here. So that was posted. So every day, whenever you go there, you'll see new comments, new kind of interactions. It's sometimes people speak directly to Dr. Li. Very often they were just there. It's like it's a space for talking about their lives. A lot of the time, people talking about their difficulties. Students will be talking about difficulties of finding a job, things like that. And so, because so many people spend so much time on this page, it has become known as a kind of wailing wall. And so several years after the lockdown, it continues to be active, and a lot of people still watch this space quite closely. There are many other kind of mourning and memorializing activities, which I will not be able to go into, just showing this one example. Oh, here is this is actually from a page from my book where I quoted a few comments that users left for Dr. Li. Just let me read the highlighted parts. I haven't been, so this is, basically confessing personal confessions to Dr. Li. I haven't been with my girlfriend for 3 months. She's in Shanghai, I'm in Beijing. Air tickets are very cheap, but I don't know when it is going to end. Things can return to normal. So this was before the zero COVID, the lockdown was lifted. People could not travel from one city to another. The next one is another person who says to Dr. Li, Dr. Li, I have good news. Junior and senior high schools in Guangxi will start the semester on April the 7th. And the next one is somebody who said, I miss my dad. So things like that, and people continue to do it using this space. I used a lot of the lockdown diaries for doing the research for writing the book, but a lot of the information was also from all kinds of social media platforms. And of course, the lockdown diaries were posted and shared on social media platforms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these diaries and give some more examples about how people were reacting to the diary writing at the time, and what kind of impact this may have. Let me check the time. So first thing that document the lockdown diaries were, or diary writing was used for, was to document everyday experiences. I should add really that lockdown diary writing was very common during the Wuhan lockdown period, and it became so popular that very clearly more and more people began to write and share their diaries on social media. I collected for my own book project over 6,000 entries, and I've continued to sporadically go back to some of the spaces, and I can make some new discoveries. So there are just many of these kind of personal forms of sharing in text, but also in images, in photographs, and in videos. So I think one important function of this kind of practice was that it documented everyday experiences. And some of these diarists wrote explicitly about why they were doing it. They would write things like, I realized this lockdown was a historically unprecedented event. I'm a witness to history. I'm experiencing history. I better document the experiences. And so this is one example of the kind of experiences. This is delivery driver who was posting very regularly multiple entries on Weibo every day. And he explicitly called this kind of posts his own Wuhan diary. And in this particular entry was posted on January 27. His battery was out, he ran out of battery, and he broke. A lot of the delivery drivers were driving around city on moped. So he said, my moped broke down. Before the breakdown, I took a supermarket purchase order and delivered a big bag and a small bag of snacks. But the small bag was stolen. We are still observing the new year, and this happened. I hope the small bag of snacks was taken by someone who really needed it. If you ate it out of hunger, I would be happy. But please be merciful toward us, delivery drivers. This is a time of hardship. We are in the same boat, and so on. So this is a kind of typical entry that he would post, and many other kind of all the personal details of his daily life he would post on Weibo, and he considered these as his personal lockdown diary. This is another story. Another diary writer, actually it's a doctor from Wuhan Central Wuhan Hospital, Dr. Tsai. He posted very long posts on Weibo, and his postings became very popular because he was very humorous, but he also told many sad, tragic stories about what was happening in his hospital. And he talked about how he and his colleagues were working hard and how life was like, in the hospital. And this particular passage here is about he and his team. So let me just read it. So Tsai and his team, Dr. Tsai and his team, did not hesitate to continue work even after they had completed their shift, because they were moved by the sacrifices made by colleagues, some of whom had lost their lives. So the doctors had a certain number of hours a day for their shift. And in this case, they were continuing their work even after they had completed their shift. And so let me continue. The sense of comradeship that came from working closely together in a time of danger gave him strength. And the second part was the most interesting thing that he shared, that it was when he got off work and returned to his hotel room that he was sometimes overwhelmed with loneliness. So his posting on March the 12th continued. And the second part of this is a direct quote. So somehow this formatting changes when I turn this. This is from my Kindle book. So this is what Dr. Tsai wrote. It's actually better to be at work because after work, when people return to the hotel, they could not visit one another. They all have to lock themselves up in their own rooms. The cell phone becomes the best way of killing time. But when you browse your WeChat moments, you could easily see news of colleagues getting infected and even dying. Obituaries and mourning messages about colleagues around you keep popping up in the WeChat moments. They hurt. For the medical workers, they were not returning. They were not going back to their homes after work. They were all staying in the hotel after work, and they all stay. Each person stayed in one single room. So here he talked about how lonely he felt after returning to the hotel room. He would rather be working together with his colleagues, even for very long hours. So that's another kind of experience. This is experience of the medical workers. Another story in the book is I also have a lot of stories about patients, COVID patients in sheltered hospitals. So this is about one patient who posted video diaries on Red, and I was following her at the time. And also she became quite famous after posting one video. And so this passage talks about that episode. The video that she posted had more than 200,000 views and close to 2,000 comments when I checked on June 19, 2020. Many viewers commented that they were moved to tears to see such cheerful dancing in the hospital. So the video she posted was COVID patients in the shelter hospital joining a group dance led by the medical workers in the shelter hospital. And so it was a sort of for this diary writer, she was writing about her own reaction to the videos. For her, it's like, this was a cheering, dancing thing. It was good to see this kind of videos because people were staying home, feeling isolated. So toward the end of this, she wrote, "I've tried hard to control my emotions since the virus started. This afternoon when I saw this video, I couldn't hold my tears any longer. We are all ordinary people. Life is not easy for any of us. Let's do our own share, try not to leave home, and protect ourselves. So in a sense, these videos unintentionally sort of became a kind of motivating, kind of story for the viewers, gave people some hope. There were also criticisms on social media about how China's mainstream TV networks were sort of trying to make use of, turn this into a kind of propaganda. Why would you want to post such cheerful videos in the middle of a very tragic, in the middle of a period when a lot of people were having tragic experiences full of hardships? So there were also criticism. But there are also many reactions, positive reactions to this kind of videos. But that's shared only by one user. There are many similar kind of video diaries as well. Let's see how much time I have. I'll try to speed up a little bit. So this is another story. It's about a story about this picture, the photograph which I used as the cover of my book, captured a particular moment in the lockdown period. This is in Wuhan Central, not Wuhan, it's a hospital in Wuhan. And standing there is a physician, the doctor, volunteer from Shanghai. And he was taking this patient, COVID patient, 87 years old, across the hospital campus to the CT section for exam. In the middle of their walk, they paused to watch the sunset. And the photograph was taken by a volunteer college student. And when I was looking around for a book cover, with the help of friends in China, I was able to get in touch with this photographer and got approval to use this for my book cover. And when this photograph was posted on social media at the time, it became instantly viral. There was, again, it sort of brought a sense of hope to a city that was in deep distress. And again, a lot of diarists would write about their reactions to this photograph. And I have here sharing one passage about a feminist activist who painted this. This activist actually painted a series of paintings about major incidents during the Wuhan lockdown. She also painted a watercolor of this photograph, and then she wrote the following. And this is quote, under conditions of pressure and anxiety, many people had a sense of serious deprivation, and the two of them cared enough to stop and watch the sunset. This is like you still maintain your habit of growing flowers, even though you were living in plight. This act represents life beyond bare existence. It transcends the if others can manage, why can't you kind of admonition. I suppose this is why the image moves me. So she shares her own experience of being moved by this photograph. Many diarists wrote about things in their diary as a way of cheering themselves up. So it's almost like a self mobilization. And this is one quote. This is actually a direct quote from a diary entry. To do one thing well requires a strong will. It requires a clear goal and guidance. Giving up is easy. When there are obstacles and one difficulty after another, one must overcome laziness and cheer oneself on in order to persevere. Only in this way can one act more effectively. Neither the continuation of the pandemic nor the busy work schedule after the resumption of class has caused me to skip even a single day of diary. I've written close to 100,000 words. The daily habit of writing makes me overcome all difficulties. Nothing can stop me from writing, rain or wind. Similar kind of ideas, thoughts were shared in a lot of the diary entries. And it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy to write a diary anytime and to persist, right? Day after day, and people try to persevere, try to persist, and especially in the early days, there was nobody knew when the lockdown would end, and they would promise to themselves, "I have to keep writing until the lockdown was lifted." And so there is a lot of this kind of self-mobilization, but it's also a way of helping themselves to manage the pandemic. These are some entries from these screenshots of some of these diary entries. On the right hand we have the sketches. On the left hand bottom, these are user comments, interactions. Right and bottom, this is a screenshot of video blogs from Red. Okay, so those are some of the examples I will share about the multiple ways that lockdown diaries were used. What kind of impact when we talk about all these many different forms of civic engagement using social media? Now, just very briefly mention these. We have no time to talk about them really. I would argue that civic organizing provided much needed support, all kinds of support, logistics, supplies, and so on. The protest activities, all kinds of verbal protests, really, complaints, a lot of them are complaints, but some of them became viral when they were posted on social media. Also influenced policy and policymakers. Government bureaucrats had to react to a lot of these voices. The diary writing itself, because it was regular, activity day after day, and many people try to do this regularly, created a kind of new social rhythm, a new kind of solidarity, which was particularly important when social solidarity was disrupted, right? The regular, our daily life is a kind of always has a certain kind of rhythm. But once the lockdown was started, that kind of rhythm was disrupted. But the diary writing created a kind of social rhythm, a new social rhythm. It certainly gave voice and visibility to the experiences of regular people. And they produced very, I think, extremely valuable historical records of COVID experiences. One question we will have to ask is, how did all this happen, right? It's an extraordinary period of time. China has its, very special circumstances, political, cultural, social, especially when we talk about social media. Question that would come to mind immediately is, so what about censorship, right? How can you post all this information? How can you protest? How can you do all these things? How did all this happen? It's a long story, so I have to be really brief and just go over a few things on my slide. One thing is about the platforms, about all these social media platforms. Nowadays we call them platforms, right? Like Facebook, Twitter, they are platforms. But many years ago, in the early history of the internet, we just call them websites. But let me just use the language of platforms. They're not, platforms. The job of censorship really is delegated to the platforms by the government agencies. But platforms they are ambivalent about censorship because why? They depend on traffic, right? Platforms, all social media have to attract traffic, and if they keep censoring people, then that's killing their traffic, that's killing themselves. So they're very ambivalent about how to do this, and they have all kinds of strategies. I wrote about this many years ago in my first book on the power of the internet in China, that was published in 2009, when I interviewed a major website editor who told me things like this. This is a quote from the interview, and this is in the book. Basic idea is that they like heated language, they like protest activities, they like interactions, they like a lot of heated debates, because that creates attention that attracts interest and attracts traffic. But then they also have to make sure that this debate, this kind of discourse does not go beyond limits. And so they watch very carefully. They have very kind of savvy strategies about when to stop, when not to stop. And I'm not going to read that. Similar kind of research, this is just published last year. I've seen in recent years several research projects with similar conclusions, and we can get a sense of this from the title of this paper. Promote diligently, so platforms would promote their platform, the interactions diligently, and censor politely. Similar idea as the one I shared from my book. The most recent book, but Dr. Ma, who I happened to read this book in its manuscript shape, which I think is excellent, and she's now, I think, a scholar at Peking University. Very systematic analysis about how the Chinese government is kind of, again, in a kind of dilemma about how to manage all these platforms. They also want a prosperous internet economy, but at the same time, they also want to manage the kind of information that is circulating online. That kind of dilemma gives an opportunity to the private internet firms, to the extent that the internet firms can maintain certain degrees of autonomy in operating their business. And therefore, we see that kind of spaces for citizen expression. So that's the kind of from the regulation side of the story, from regulation and platform management. On the part of citizens and civic groups, they also are very creative, skilled users, and they always try to adapt to the circumstances. So the organizing, for instance, on social media tend to be very individualized or informal instead of formal organizations. They are often based on pre-existing digital organizations like fandom clubs, feminist organizing. Fandom clubs are there. So that's the main organizational forms during this period have these features. And then the kind of activities they organize tend to be civic and non-confrontational. There are protest activities, but they tend typically not directly protest against lockdown policies. Of course, we'll see things change later on. But they're directed at that time during the Wuhan period, directed at concrete issues which resulted from the poor implementation of lockdown policies, like grocery difficulties, delivery difficulties because of lockdown, and then that caused a lot of protest activities. And finally, online users have all kinds of creative forms of countering censorship, and this is just one example of a story that was censored, story about the Dr. Li Wenliang, which was censored, and then internet users began to turn this into all kinds of other languages, foreign languages, but also other kinds of not quite legible languages. In this case, for example, emoji language as a translation of the original story. And these are circulated. This became a phenomenon in its own right. And it sort of really, I think, made the story even better known than before it was censored. So a lot of creative strategies we can talk about. I think my time is up. I should really stop. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions. And I'll stop my sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Yang. This was wonderful, very interesting discussion, and so much information that came out of the Wuhan lockdown and the ways that people dealt with that. It's fascinating. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's open and ready for people to put questions there. How quickly did the censors deal with the new scripts and new languages in terms of their postings?
Well, the the platforms often they are very savvy in the sense that this was mentioned in the interviews I did long ago, but also in recent studies. Sometimes there will be just a time lag that give it a few minutes even, and then the message could spread, and then they would delete it. So that's and then they sort of try to handle this in a very flexible way. But then people also keep inventing new languages, right? Because when coded language is quite common as a way of bypassing, especially automatic algorithm kind of managed censorship, AI automatic censorship. There's people just come up with new coded language, and it's quite remarkably other users could understand this new coded language very quickly. I think this has to do with something I mentioned early on. The huge number of users online, that scale is very important. That when so many people are doing things together, something new, happens every minute. You might say, and new languages would be created in the middle of this very quickly, and so there is that's again part of the kind of typical sort of game between censorship and the users.
So we have a question. Could this kind of free expression influence issues such as politics or international relations, or are those mostly avoided? And is it indirect influence?
Well, it certainly does, in the sense that I have a chapter in the book about COVID nationalism, which is especially in the latter part of the lockdown after March 2020, there was rising waves of nationalism because of the kind of anti-China, anti-Asian kind of discourse from outside of China. And so there is a kind of nationalistic discourse growing on social media and trying to counter the kind of negative depictions of the Chinese experiences during lockdown. And we also know, and we had a conference a few years ago, actually 2021, when one of the speakers studied Chinese diplomats' use of social media and how they use social media to try to, again, project a particular kind of image. So definitely, I think it's also a field that's much studied now by scholars who work on international relations.
Another viewer has asked, have you looked at the Shanghai lockdown period as part of your research plan?
I only follow this. I definitely followed what was happening during the Shanghai lockdown and later, but not in a way that I did for Wuhan. I was also trying to follow diary writing during the Shanghai period. Not as much. Partly, I think, a reflection of the kind of tightened control of information after the Wuhan lockdown. So there was not as much diary writing. There were still lockdown diaries during the Shanghai period, and they were also extremely informative, but they were there's a difference. As I mentioned, during Wuhan, people, you write a diary and post them, day after day, right? Regularly, daily basis is has to be a series of entries. In the Shanghai period, especially in the first period of the Shanghai lockdown, there were very few people posting diaries. But the second period, when it became more public, when there were more public voices, more complaints and protests, people began to post their diaries, but they were posting their diaries that they wrote 2 weeks ago, a week ago, right? And they would post a whole week's worth of diaries together. So that's different from the Wuhan time. That's why I mentioned that in the Wuhan period, the regular posting of diary and people's discussions, interaction, created a kind of daily rhythm, which was missing during the Shanghai period.
And we're gonna leave with this last question, but what do you want the Chinese people to know about your research into the lockdown and people's diaries?
A lot of this information, basically all the stories, I would think, are well-known stories from well-known stories in China by Chinese users. I guess I want to, if I were to say, who was the main targeted audience. I was really trying to write a book for the English reading public, to tell them stories about everyday experiences in Wuhan in 2020, because I think these are very powerful, moving experiences, and they deserve to be better known. They deserve, and the people there deserve to be more visible. And that's, I think, one of my main intentions. So the stories, a lot of these stories are well known. They are viral stories on social media. Some of them, of course, are lesser known, probably very little known, because one person's personal experience, which I quote in the diary, not as well known, but mostly they are quite well known among the Chinese public.
Well, thank you. I don't think we know about it in the two-dimensional way the press here has covered that story has been a detriment to our understanding, and I thank you for this. It was a very insightful talk and excellent discussion. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar, and thanks to everyone for visiting us and being part of this series. This is the last webinar for this academic year, so we'll see you again in the fall, and enjoy your summer. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.